So I really wanted to read The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane to my little smarties this year. So I'm going to give it a go. If you have this book at home, you can follow along. Otherwise, you'll have to tune in. The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, written by Kate DiCamillo. Chapter 1. Once, in a house on Egypt Street, there lived a rabbit who was made almost entirely of china. He had china arms and china legs, china paws and a china head, a china torso and a china nose. His arms and legs were jointed and joined by wire so that his china elbows and china knees could be bent, giving him much freedom of movement. His ears were made of real rabbit fur, and beneath the fur, there were strong, bendable wires, which allowed the ears to be arranged into poses that reflected the rabbit's mood: jaunty, tired, full of ennui. I don't know that word. E-N-N-U-I. You'll have to look it up. I keep meaning to, keep forgetting. His tail, too, was made of real rabbit fur and was fluffy and soft and well-shaped. The rabbit's name was Edward Tulane, and he was tall. He measured almost 3 feet from the tip of his ears to the tip of his feet. His eyes were painted a penetrating and intelligent blue. In all, Edward Tulane felt himself to be an exceptional specimen. Only his whiskers gave him pause. They were long and elegant, as they should be, but they were full of uncertain origin. Edward felt quite strongly that they were not the whiskers of a real rabbit. Whom the whiskers had belonged to initially? What unsavory animal? Was a question that Edward could not bear to consider for too long, and so he did not. He preferred, as a rule, not to think unpleasant thoughts. Edward's mistress was a 10-year-old dark-haired girl named Abilene Tulane, who thought almost as highly of Edward as Edward thought of himself. Each morning, after she dressed herself for school, Abilene dressed Edward. The china rabbit was in possession of an extraordinary wardrobe, composed of handmade silk suits, custom fine shoes, fashioned from the finest leather, and designed specifically for his rabbit feet, and a wide array of hats equipped with holes so that he could easily fit over Edward's large and expressive ears. Each pair of well-cut pants had a small pocket for Edward's gold pocket watch. Abilene wound his watch for him every morning. "Now, Edward," she said to him after she was done winding his watch, "when the big hand is on the 12 and the little hand is on the 3, I will come home to you." She placed Edward on a chair in the dining room and positioned the chair so that Edward was looking out the window, and he could see the path that led up to the Tulane front door. Abilene balanced the watch on his left leg. She kissed the tips of his ears, and then she left. And Edward spent the day staring out at Egypt Street, listening to the tick of his watch and waiting. Of all the seasons of the year, the rabbit most preferred winter, for the sun set early then, and the dining room windows became dark, and Edward could see his own reflection in the glass. And what a reflection it was! What an elegant figure he cut! Edward never ceased to be amazed at his own fineness. In the evening, Edward sat at the dining room table with the other members of the Tulane family: Abilene, her mother and father, and Abilene's grandmother, who was called Pellegrina. True, Edward's ears barely cleared the top of the table, and true, he spent the duration of the meal staring straight ahead at nothing but the bright and blinding white of the tablecloth. But he was there, a rabbit, at the table. Abilene's parents found it charming that Abilene considered Edward real, and that she sometimes requested that a phrase or a story be repeated because Edward hadn't heard it. "Papa," Abilene would say, I'm afraid that Edward didn't catch that last bit. Abeline's father would then turn in the direction of Edward's ears and speak slowly, repeating what he had just said, for the benefit of the China Rabbit. Edward pretended, out of courtesy to Abeline, to listen, but in truth he was not very interested in what people had to say. And also, he did not care for Abeline's parents and their condescending manner toward him. All adults, in fact, condescended to him. Only Abeline's grandmother spoke to him as Abeline did, as one equal to another. Pellegrina was old. She had a large, sharp nose and bright black eyes that shone like dark stars. It was Pellegrina who was responsible for Edward's existence. It was she who had commissioned his making. She who had ordered the silk suits and his pocket watch, his jaunty hats and his bendable ears, his fine leather shoes and the jointed arms and legs, all from a master craftsman in her native France. It was Pellegrina who had given him to Abeline as a gift on her 7th birthday. And it was Pellegrina who came each night to tuck Abeline into her bed and Edward into his. "Will you tell us a story, Pellegrina?" Abeline asked her grandmother each night. "Not today, lady," said Pellegrina. "When?" asked Abeline. "What night?" "Soon," said Pellegrina. "Soon there will be a story." And then she turned off the light, and Edward and Abeline lay in the dark of the bedroom. "I love you, Edward," Abeline said each night after Pellegrina had left. She said those words, and then she waited, almost as if she expected Edward to say something in return. Edward said nothing. He said nothing because, of course, he could not speak. He lay in his small bed next to Abeline's large one. He stared up at the ceiling and listened to the sound of her breath entering and leaving her body, knowing that soon she would be asleep. Because Edward's eyes were painted on and he could not close them, he was always awake. Sometimes, if Abeline put him into his bed on his side instead of his back, he could see through the cracks in the curtains and out into the dark night sky. On clear nights, the stars shone, and their pinprick light comforted Edward in a way that he could not understand. Often he stared at the stars all night until the dark finally gave way to dawn. Chapter 2. And in this manner, Edward's days passed one into the other. Nothing remarkable happened. Oh, there was the occasional small domestic drama. Once when Abeline was at school, the neighbor's dog, a male brindled boxer, inexplicably named Rosie, came into the house uninvited and unannounced and lifted his leg on the dining room table, spraying the white tablecloth with urine. He even trotted over and sniffed Edward. And before Edward even had time to consider the implications of being sniffed by a dog, he was in Rosie's mouth. And Rosie was shaking him back and forth so vigorously, growling and drooling. Fortunately, Abeline's mother walked past the dining room and witnessed Edward's suffering. "Drop it," she shouted to Rosie. And Rosie, surprised into obedience, did as he was told. Edward's silk suit was stained with drool, and his head ached for several days afterward. But it was his ego that had suffered the most damage. Abeline's mother had referred to him as it, and she was more outraged at the dog urine on her tablecloth than about the indignities that Edward had suffered at the jaws of Rosie. And then there was this one time that a maid, new to the Tulane household and eager to impress her employers with her diligence, came upon Edward sitting on the chair in the dining room. "What's this bunny doing here?" she said out loud. Edward did not care at all for the word bunny. He found it derogatory in the extreme. The maid bent over him and looked into his eyes. She said. She stood back up. She put her hands on her hips. I reckon you're just like every other thing in this house, something that needs dusting. And so the maid vacuumed Edward Tulane. She sucked each of his long ears up in the vacuum cleaner hose. She pawed at his clothes and beat his tail. She dusted his face with brutality and efficiency. And in her zeal to clean him, she vacuumed Edward's gold pocket watch right off his lap. The watch went into the maw of the vacuum cleaner with a distressing clank that the maid did not even seem to hear. When she was done, she put the dining room chair back at the table, and uncertain about exactly where Edward belonged, she finally decided to shove him in among the dolls on a shelf in Abeline's bedroom. "That's right," said the maid. "There you go." She left Edward on the shelf at a most awkward and inhumane angle. His nose was actually touching his knees, and he waited there with the dolls twittering and giggling at him like a flock of demented and unfriendly birds, until Abeline came home from school and found him missing and ran from room to room calling his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Edward!" There was no way, of course, for him to let her know where he was. No way for him to answer her. He could only sit and wait. When Abeline found him, she held him close. So close that Edward could feel her heart beating, leaping almost out of her chest in its agitation. "Edward," she said. "Oh, Edward, I love you. I never want you to be away from me." The rabbit, too, was experiencing a great emotion, but it was not love. It was annoyance that he had been mighty inconvenienced, and that he had been handled by a maid as cavalierly as an inanimate object, a serving bowl or a teapot. The only satisfaction to be had from the whole affair was that the new maid was dismissed immediately. Edward's pocket watch was located later, deep within the bowels of the vacuum cleaner, dented but still in working condition. It was returned to him by Abeline's father, who presented it with a mocking bow. "Sir Edward," he said, "your timepiece, I believe?" The Rosie affair and the vacuum cleaner incident, those were the great dramas of Edward's life, until the night of Abeline's 11th birthday, when at the dinner table, as the cake was being served, the ship was mentioned. So you'll have to tune back in to chapter 3 and 4